The fluorescent lights of Meridian Industries' corporate lobby cast harsh shadows across the worn leather portfolio, clutched in Robert Smith's hands as he waited for what might be her last chance at steady employment. To the impeccably dressed executives gliding past toward glass elevators, he was just another applicant for the janitorial position, a single father in a thrift store blazer whose best days seemed behind him. None of them could have imagined that this quiet man with calloused hands and tired eyes had once been the hero who saved the life of their CEO's daughter in a moment of pure courage that would forever change both their destinies. Follow the extraordinary journey of a former paramedic whose hidden past will transform not just his own life, but the entire culture of one of the city's most prestigious companies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Robert adjusted his position in the uncomfortable waiting room chair, trying to ignore the way his second-hand interview outfit felt too tight around the shoulders. The navy blazer had been a find at the Riverside Community Thrift Store, professional enough for a job interview, worn enough to fit his budget of exactly $15. At 36, he had learned to make compromises that once would have seemed unthinkable. The morning had started like every other for the past 8 months since he'd lost his job at Denver General Hospital. He'd woken at 5:30 a.m. in the cramped 2-bedroom apartment he shared with his 12-year-old daughter Catalina, preparing a breakfast of generic cereal and powdered milk while mentally rehearsing answers to interview questions. His daughter had wished him luck with the fierce loyalty that had sustained them both through the hardest year of their lives. "You'll get this job, Papa," Catalina had said, adjusting Robert's collar with the serious expression she'd worn too often lately. "You're the smartest person I know." Robert had smiled and kissed his daughter's forehead, not mentioning that intelligence rarely mattered when you were applying to empty trash cans and mop floors. What mattered was showing up, working hard, and asking no questions, qualities that would keep him invisible to the people who mattered in places like Meridian Industries. The lobby around him buzzed with the quiet efficiency of corporate success. Employees in tailored suits moved with purposeful strides, their conversations peppered with industry jargon and casual references to budget meetings and quarterly projections. A few glanced his way with polite disinterest before returning to their smartphones and important calls. Robert had once moved through hospital corridors with similar confidence when he wore EMT uniforms instead of thrift store blazers, when his hands saved lives instead of scrubbing surfaces. That was before the incident, before the lawsuit, before his EMT certification was revoked and his reputation destroyed by a single moment of split-second judgment that had saved a child's life but violated protocol in a way that cost him everything. The irony wasn't lost on him, applying for a position cleaning the offices of Meridian Industries, the same building where he'd once rushed through these very lobby doors with a critically injured patient on a stretcher. He'd been part of the elite emergency response team then, trusted with life-and-death decisions, respected by doctors and nurses who relied on his expertise. Now he hoped they wouldn't recognize his face when he emptied their wastebaskets. Robert Smith? A woman in her 50s emerged from behind the reception desk, clipboard in hand and the brisk manner of someone accustomed to processing a steady stream of applicants. "I'm Janet Walsh, Human Resources. Thank you for coming in today." Robert stood, extending his hand with the firm handshake his father had taught him years ago. "Thank you for considering my application, Ms. Walsh." They walked toward a small conference room past walls lined with awards and photographs celebrating Meridian Industries' achievements in biotechnology research. Robert recognized some of the faces from newspaper articles, brilliant scientists and executives who had built the company into a leader in medical device innovation. He wondered what they would think if they knew a former paramedic was about to interview for their night cleaning crew. "I see from your application that you're available for the overnight shift," Ms. Walsh said, settling into her chair across from Elena. "That's Sunday through Thursday, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The work involves cleaning offices, restrooms, and common areas throughout our corporate headquarters. It's physical work, and we maintain high standards for cleanliness and discretion." Robert nodded, his hands folded calmly in his lap despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "I understand completely. I'm comfortable with physical work, and I value the importance of maintaining a professional environment." He didn't mention that he was comfortable with far more demanding physical work, like performing CPR in the back of a speeding ambulance or carrying injured patients down flights of stairs. He didn't explain that his definition of high standards had once meant the difference between life and death, not the difference between clean and spotless. "Your previous employment shows a gap of several months," Ms. Walsh observed, consulting the sparse resume Elena had managed to compile. "Can you explain that period?" The question Robert had been dreading. He'd rehearsed various versions of the truth, searching for words that would explain without revealing too much. "I was working in healthcare until last year. Due to circumstances beyond my control, I needed to transition to a different field. I've been caring for my daughter and looking for stable employment that allows me to maintain a good work-life balance." It was true, if incomplete. He had been caring for Catalina, watching his daughter struggle with the shame of having a father whose career had ended in scandal. He had been looking for stable employment, discovering that a revoked EMT license and a lawsuit settlement made him nearly unemployable in any field that required background checks or professional references. Ms. Walsh made a note on her clipboard. "The position offers health insurance after 90 days and 2 weeks of paid vacation after 1 year. The starting salary is $14 per hour. We conduct background checks and require 3 professional references." Robert's heart sank slightly at the mention of references, but he maintained his composed expression. He'd managed to secure 2 references from former colleagues willing to speak about his work ethic, rather than the circumstances of his departure from healthcare. A 3rd reference had come from Mrs. Patterson, his elderly neighbor who had watched Catalina during Robert's job search and could attest to his reliability and character. "I understand," Elena replied. "I'm confident my references will speak to my work ethic and dependability." What he couldn't say was that one of those references might also mention his medical training, his quick thinking under pressure, or his instinct to help others regardless of personal cost. The very qualities that had once made him an exceptional paramedic might now seem overqualified for a position that required him to remain unseen and unheard. As the interview continued with standard questions about availability and experience, Robert found himself studying Ms. Walsh's face for any sign of recognition. Had she seen him before, perhaps during one of the emergency calls that had brought Robert to this very building? The corporate world and the emergency services world rarely intersected in ways that created lasting memories, but the possibility lingered in the back of Robert's mind. He answered each question thoughtfully, drawing on years of customer service experience and his natural ability to connect with people. Even in this stripped-down version of himself, sitting in a borrowed blazer and hoping for a job that would barely cover rent, Robert maintained the quiet dignity that had always defined his approach to work and life. The interview concluded with Ms. Walsh explaining the next steps in the hiring process and promising a decision within a week. Robert thanked her again, shook hands, and walked back through the impressive lobby toward the exit, passing the same executives and employees who had barely noticed his arrival. Outside, the autumn air carried the promise of an early winter, and Robert pulled his thin jacket closer as he walked toward the bus stop. In a few hours, he would collect Catalina from school and help with homework at their small kitchen table. Tonight, like every night, he would tuck his daughter into bed with stories of better days ahead, maintaining the hope that had carried them both through their darkest months. He had no way of knowing that his application had already set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just his own circumstances, but the life of a young girl who had never forgotten the face of the man who had once saved her life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bus ride home gave Robert Smith time to reflect on the fragments of his former life that he'd carefully omitted from the interview. As downtown Denver's gleaming corporate towers gave way to modest residential neighborhoods, he stared through the scratched window and remembered when these same streets had been his domain, not as a job seeker in borrowed clothes, but as paramedic Robert Smith, Unit 47, racing through intersections with sirens blazing and lives hanging in the balance. His daughter Catalina was waiting by the apartment window when he arrived, her school backpack already positioned by the door for their daily walk to Riverside Elementary. At 12, she had inherited his steady demeanor and her late mother's intuitive understanding of people, a combination that made her wise beyond her years and fiercely protective of the father who had become her entire world. "How did it go, Papa?" she asked, falling into step beside him as they headed toward her school. Her voice carried the careful optimism of a child who had learned not to expect too much, but couldn't quite stop hoping. "It went well," Robert replied, adjusting the straps of her backpack with the practiced efficiency of 3 years of single parenthood. "Ms. Walsh seemed professional, and the company has good benefits. We'll know something by next week." What he didn't tell her was how the interview had stirred memories he'd worked hard to bury. Sitting in that sterile conference room, discussing his availability for night shifts and his comfort with physical labor, Robert had fought the urge to mention the real physical demands he'd once handled routinely. The 100-pound patients he'd carried down flights of stairs, the chest compressions he'd performed for 20-minute stretches while his partner navigated traffic, the split-second decisions that had meant the difference between someone's child coming home or not coming home at all. The transformation from paramedic Smith to Robert the job applicant hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual erosion that began with a single emergency call on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in March 18 months ago. A multi-vehicle accident on Interstate 25 had brought his unit screaming toward what appeared to be a routine response, until they'd arrived to find an overturned sedan with a unconscious child trapped in the back seat, rising water from a broken storm drain, threatening to drown her before they could extract her. Protocol had been clear: wait for the fire department's extraction team, maintain spinal immobilization, follow established procedures. But the water had been rising faster than anyone anticipated, and the child, a girl no older than Catalina, had been slipping toward unconsciousness in a way that Robert's 8 years of emergency medicine experience recognized as immediately life-threatening. He'd made the decision in 30 seconds. Ignore protocol, enter the unstable vehicle, and extract the patient himself before the rising water could claim another victim. It had worked. The girl had survived, made a full recovery, and gone home to her family with nothing more than minor injuries and a story she would tell for the rest of her life. The lawsuit had come 6 weeks later. The family's insurance company, looking to minimize their liability payments, had hired lawyers who argued that Robert's deviation from established protocol had actually worsened the girl's injuries. They'd claimed that proper extraction procedures would have prevented the minor spinal compression she'd experienced during the rescue, ignoring the fact that following those procedures would have resulted in her drowning in 3 feet of stormwater. The legal process had consumed 18 months of Robert's life, draining his savings and destroying his reputation within the emergency services community. Even colleagues who privately supported his actions had been reluctant to testify on his behalf, unwilling to risk their own careers by challenging department protocol. The case had eventually been settled out of court, with Robert's insurance covering the family's medical expenses in exchange for his agreement to surrender his EMT certification and accept permanent disqualification from emergency medical services. The girl he'd saved, 10-year-old Victoria Hartwell, had written him a letter during the legal proceedings, thanking him for saving her life and asking why the adults were angry at him for helping her. Robert had never responded, knowing that any contact with the family could complicate the legal situation, but he'd kept the letter in his wallet as a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing carried a price that seemed impossibly unfair. Hi. Now, walking his own daughter to school and discussing homework assignments and weekend plans, Robert wondered what Victoria was doing. Was she playing soccer this fall? Had she started middle school? Did she ever think about the paramedic who had pulled her from that overturned car? Or had the trauma of the accident erased those memories entirely? "Papa, you're doing that thing again," Catalina said, tugging gently on his sleeve to bring him back to the present. "What thing?" "The thinking too hard thing. Your forehead gets all wrinkled, and you forget to listen when I'm talking." Robert smiled despite himself, marveling at his daughter's ability to read his moods with surgical precision. "Sorry, Misha, what were you saying?" "I was asking if you think we could go to the Science Museum this weekend if you get the job. They have a new exhibit about the human body, and Mrs. Rodriguez says it shows how paramedics help people." The innocent question hit Robert like a physical blow. Catalina's teacher had no way of knowing about his background, but her casual reference to paramedics served as another reminder of the professional identity he'd lost. His daughter had been only 10 when the lawsuit began, too young to fully understand the legal complexities, but old enough to sense that something was destroying her father's career and their family's stability. "We'll see about the museum," he said carefully. "Let's wait to hear about the job first." As they approached the school, Robert watched Catalina join the stream of children heading toward the main building, her backpack bouncing with each step and her dark hair catching the morning sunlight. She turned to wave at him before disappearing through the front doors, a daily ritual that never failed to remind him why he'd accepted the destruction of his career without fighting back harder. Whatever price he'd paid for saving Victoria Hartwell, it had been worth paying to ensure that his own daughter's future remained secure. The walk back to their apartment took him past the fire station, where he'd once been a welcome visitor, sharing coffee with the crew between calls and coordinating responses to major emergencies. Now he crossed the street to avoid the awkwardness of running into former colleagues who might recognize him but wouldn't know what to say about his fall from grace. At home, Robert settled at the kitchen table with the laptop he'd bought secondhand to conduct his job search, scrolling through employment websites and trying to imagine a future that didn't involve emergency medicine. The Meridian Industries position represented his best opportunity in months, a night shift that would allow him to be present for Catalina during the day, benefits that would cover her healthcare needs, and work that would keep him invisible to the professional world that had rejected him. His phone buzzed with a text message from his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, offering to pick up Catalina from school if he needed to attend any follow-up interviews. The elderly woman had become an unexpected ally during his job search, providing childcare and emotional support without asking intrusive questions about his past. She knew he'd once worked in healthcare and had experienced some kind of professional setback, but she'd never pressed for details beyond what he'd volunteered. Robert typed back his thanks and set the phone aside, returning to his laptop and the monotonous task of submitting applications for positions that required no special skills, no background in life-saving techniques, and no ability to make split-second decisions under pressure. Each application felt like another step away from the person he'd once been, but also another step toward the stability that Catalina deserved. He had no way of knowing that 15 miles across the city, in the executive offices of Meridian Industries, a conversation was taking place that would soon transform his careful plans for an invisible future. The CEO's daughter had just returned from a weekend camping trip, full of stories about her outdoor adventures and excited to share them with her mother. Among those stories was a casual mention of a dream she'd had the night before, a dream about the paramedic who had once saved her life, and how she'd always wondered what had happened to the man who had been brave enough to pull her from that overturned car. Victoria Hartwell had grown into a confident 14-year-old with her mother's sharp intellect and her father's sense of justice. She'd never forgotten Robert Smith's face, and she'd never stopped believing that the adults who had punished him for saving her life had been terribly, inexcusably wrong. 16 floors above the lobby where Robert Smith had sat nervously adjusting his thrift store blazer, Dr. Amanda Hartwell stood behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, reviewing the quarterly biotechnology reports that would determine Meridian Industries' research funding for the next fiscal year. At 42, she had built her reputation on an unwavering commitment to innovation and a management style that demanded excellence from every department under her leadership. The wall behind her mahogany desk told the story of a woman who had never accepted limitations. Her medical degree from Johns Hopkins hung beside her MBA from Wharton, flanked by awards from the American Medical Association and recognition from Forbes as one of the top healthcare executives under 50. Photographs captured moments of professional triumph, accepting the Biotechnology Innovation Award, delivering the keynote address at the International Medical Device Conference, and shaking hands with senators at congressional hearings on healthcare reform. Yet for all her professional achievements, the single photograph that commanded the most prominent position on her desk was a candid shot of her 14-year-old daughter Victoria, caught mid-laugh during a family vacation to Yellowstone National Park. In that image, Victoria's eyes sparkled with the kind of uninhibited joy that had become increasingly rare since the accident that had nearly claimed her life 4 years ago. Dr. Hartwell's assistant knocked softly before entering with the morning's priority correspondence. The Henderson merger documents are ready for your signature, and the board presentation has been updated with the new clinical trial data. Also, your lunch meeting with the research consortium has been moved to 1:30. Thank you, Patricia. Any word from Victoria's school about the field trip permission forms? Already handled. The forms are filed, and I've confirmed your attendance at the parent information session next Thursday. Dr. Hartwell nodded, her attention already shifting to the complex financial projections spread across her computer screen. Meridian Industries had grown from a promising startup to a billion-dollar biotechnology leader under her guidance, developing medical devices that had revolutionized emergency cardiac care and trauma response systems. The irony that her company's innovations were saving lives in emergency rooms across the country was never lost on her, particularly given the circumstances that had shaped her family's relationship with emergency medical services. The transformation of Amanda Hartwell from a practicing physician to a corporate executive had been driven by a single, terrifying night in March 4 years ago, when a routine drive home from Victoria's piano recital had turned into every parent's worst nightmare. A drunk driver running a red light had sent their sedan spinning across 3 lanes of traffic before it flipped and landed upside down in a rapidly flooding storm drain. Amanda had awakened to find herself hanging upside down, held in place by her seatbelt, with the metallic taste of blood in her mouth and the sound of rushing water growing louder by the second. Her first coherent thought had been Victoria, who had been unconscious in the back seat, her small body motionless as water began seeping through the shattered rear window. The next 20 minutes had passed in a blur of sirens, shouting voices, and the growing certainty that her daughter was going to die while Amanda watched helplessly from 3 feet away. The fire department had arrived first, followed by police and paramedics, but the rising water and the vehicle's unstable position had created a rescue scenario that defied standard protocols. She remembered the heated discussion among the first responders, voices raised in disagreement about extraction procedures and safety protocols, while precious seconds ticked away. She remembered screaming at them to stop talking and start acting, her voice raw with terror and frustration as she watched the water level creeping higher around Victoria's still form. Then everything had changed. A paramedic, a man whose name she would later learn was Robert Smith, had approached the vehicle with the kind of calm determination that she recognized from her own years in trauma surgery. While his colleagues continued debating the safest approach, he had assessed the situation with surgical precision and made a decision that would haunt the legal system for the next 18 months. He had entered the unstable vehicle alone. Working in water up to his chest, ignoring the shouts of his supervisor and the groaning protests of the damaged car frame, paramedic Smith had carefully extracted Victoria from her seat, maintaining spinal stabilization while navigating the treacherous conditions that had paralyzed the other responders. His movements had been deliberate and confident, the actions of someone who understood that sometimes saving a life required accepting risks that bureaucratic protocols were designed to eliminate. Victoria had been unconscious but breathing when he'd carried her to safety. The subsequent ambulance ride to Denver General had been a blur of medical interventions and cautious optimism. But Amanda had known with absolute certainty that her daughter was alive only because one man had been willing to act when others had hesitated. The lawsuit that followed had been the most agonizing decision of Amanda's professional life. Her insurance company had insisted that the paramedic's deviation from protocol had caused additional injuries during the extraction, injuries that proper procedures would have prevented. Their lawyers had painted a picture of a reckless first responder whose cowboy mentality had endangered a patient unnecessarily, arguing that following established safety protocols would have achieved the same result without the minor spinal compression that Victoria had experienced. Amanda had known it was a lie. She had been there, watching the water rise, understanding with a physician's training that proper protocols would have meant waiting for equipment that wouldn't have arrived in time. But challenging her own insurance company would have meant accepting personal liability for millions in medical expenses, risking her family's financial security, and potentially compromising Victoria's access to the specialized care she needed during her recovery. The decision to allow the lawsuit to proceed had felt like a betrayal of everything she believed about medical ethics and professional integrity. She had been forced to sit in depositions and listen to lawyers systematically destroy the reputation of the man who had saved her daughter's life, knowing that her silence was the price of Victoria's continued treatment. The case had settled 18 months later, with Robert Smith surrendering his medical certification and accepting permanent disqualification from emergency services. Amanda had never spoken to him directly, never had the opportunity to explain the impossible position she'd been placed in, never been able to thank him for the courage that had given her daughter a future. The guilt from that silence had driven her away from clinical practice and into the corporate world, where she could channel her medical knowledge into developing better emergency response technologies. Every device that Meridian Industries created, every innovation that improved patient outcomes in trauma situations, felt like a small payment on an impossible debt. Victoria had recovered completely from her physical injuries, but the emotional impact of the accident and its aftermath had shaped her into a young woman with an acute sense of justice and an intolerance for institutional failures. She had never understood why the man who saved her life had been punished, and she had never stopped asking questions that Amanda couldn't answer without revealing the legal complexities that had destroyed an innocent man's career. Now reviewing the latest quarterly reports and preparing for another board meeting, Amanda found herself thinking about Victoria's recent comments about the accident. Her daughter had been having dreams about the rescue, vivid recollections that suggested her memories of that night were becoming clearer as she matured. The previous weekend, Victoria had mentioned wanting to find the paramedic who had saved her, to thank him properly, and to understand why the adults had made him stop helping people. Amanda had deflected the conversation with vague promises to look into the matter someday, but she knew that Victoria's questions were becoming more persistent and more specific. Her daughter possessed the same analytical mind that had made Amanda successful in medicine and business, and she was beginning to apply that intelligence to understanding the injustices that had followed her rescue. "Hey," the intercom buzzed, interrupting Amanda's reflection. "Dr. Hartwell, Human Resources is requesting a brief meeting about the new custodial staff hiring. Apparently, there's an application that requires executive approval due to some background check complications." Amanda glanced at her schedule, noting a brief opening before her next conference call. "Send them up. I have 15 minutes." As she cleared her desk of the financial reports and prepared for the mundane task of reviewing janitorial applications, Amanda had no way of knowing that the universe was about to deliver a reckoning that would force her to confront the choices she'd made 4 years ago. The man whose career she had helped destroy was about to walk through her office door, seeking employment in the building where she had spent 4 years trying to atone for her silence. Victoria's questions about finding her rescuer were about to be answered in the most unexpected way possible, and Amanda Hartwell would finally have the opportunity to face the hero she had never been able to thank. 3 days after his interview at Meridian Industries, Robert Smith was methodically folding laundry in the cramped living room of his apartment when Catalina burst through the front door with the explosive energy that could only mean one thing: something important had happened at school. Her backpack hit the floor with a thud as she launched into an animated description of her science class presentation on emergency medical procedures. "Mrs. Rodriguez said my project was the best in the class, Papa. I explained how paramedics check for breathing and pulse, and how they have to make really fast decisions to save people's lives." Catalina's eyes sparkled with pride as she pulled a graded assignment from her folder. "She gave me an A+ and said I explained everything like I really understood how emergency medicine works." Robert examined the carefully drawn diagrams and detailed explanations his daughter had created, each page demonstrating a level of medical knowledge that most 12-year-olds wouldn't possess. He had never directly taught her these concepts, but years of living with a former paramedic had apparently osmosed into her understanding of how life-saving interventions actually functioned. "This is excellent work, Mija," he said, trying to keep the complicated emotions out of his voice. "You should be proud of how hard you worked on this." What he couldn't tell her was how seeing her enthusiasm for emergency medicine felt like watching his own dreams being reborn in someone too young to understand how quickly those dreams could be destroyed. Catalina had inherited his instinct for helping others and his ability to remain calm under pressure, qualities that would serve her well in whatever career she eventually chose. Robert just hoped she would be smart enough to choose a path that offered more security and fewer opportunities for good intentions to be twisted into legal liabilities. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID displayed a number he didn't recognize, but the professional tone of the woman on the other end immediately commanded his attention. "Mr. Smith, this is Janet Walsh from Meridian Industries Human Resources. I'm calling with an update on your application for the custodial position." Robert's pulse quickened as he gestured for Catalina to lower her voice. 3 days of waiting had prepared him for either acceptance or rejection, but the careful neutrality in Ms. Walsh's tone suggested that something more complicated was developing. "The initial screening process has been completed, and I'm pleased to inform you that you've passed the background check and reference verification. However, there's an additional step that's required for this particular position. Dr. Hartwell, our CEO, personally reviews all new hires for sensitive areas of the building. She'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning at 10:30. Robert felt a chill of apprehension that had nothing to do with the apartment's inadequate heating. CEO interviews for janitorial positions were not standard practice, and his experience with executive-level scrutiny had not ended well in the past. "Is there something specific about my application that requires this additional review?" "Not at all," Ms. Walsh assured him. "Dr. Hartwell maintains a policy of personally meeting key personnel who will have access to research facilities and executive areas. It's simply a final formality. Can you be available tomorrow morning?" "Yes, ma'am, I'll be there." After hanging up, Robert sat in his worn recliner and tried to analyze what this development might mean. In his experience, CEO involvement in hiring decisions usually signaled either an exceptional opportunity or an exceptional problem, and given his recent history, he was inclined to expect the latter. Catalina had returned to her homework at the kitchen table, but she periodically glanced up at her father with the intuitive concern that had become her default expression whenever phone calls arrived during business hours. At 12, she had developed an acute sensitivity to the subtle signs that indicated whether news was good or potentially devastating for their fragile household economy. "Was that about the job, Papa?" "Yes, they want to meet with me one more time, tomorrow morning." "That's good, right? It means they're still interested?" Robert managed a reassuring smile. "It's probably good. We'll know more tomorrow." That evening, as he helped Catalina with her math homework and prepared her lunch for the following day, Robert found himself wondering about Dr. Amanda Hartwell and what kind of CEO personally interviewed custodial staff. His limited research had revealed that she was a former physician turned biotechnology executive, someone who had built Meridian Industries into a major player in medical device innovation. The company's website featured photographs of her accepting various industry awards and speaking at conferences about healthcare technology advancement. What the website didn't reveal was why a successful executive would concern herself with the hiring decisions typically handled by human resources departments. Robert's paranoid mind conjured scenarios ranging from additional background investigations to recognition from his past life in emergency services, none of which seemed likely to end in his favor. Meanwhile, 15 floors above where Robert would soon sit for his final interview, Victoria Hartwell was having a very different kind of evening. Her mother had returned from work with a distracted expression that usually indicated complex business decisions were weighing on her mind. But tonight, there seemed to be something more personal behind her thoughtful silence. "Mom, can I ask you something about the accident?" Victoria had learned to approach this topic carefully, understanding that her mother's memories of that night carried complications she was still too young to fully comprehend. Amanda looked up from the medical journal she'd been reading, her expression immediately shifting to the careful attentiveness she reserved for conversations about the rescue. "What would you like to know?" "I've been thinking about the paramedic who saved me, the one who came into the water to get me out." Victoria set down her own homework and moved to the couch beside her mother. "Do you ever wonder what happened to him? Whether he's still helping people?" The question landed like a physical blow to Amanda's chest. For 4 years, she had wondered exactly that, carrying the guilt of knowing that her silence during the legal proceedings had contributed to the destruction of Robert Smith's career. She had kept track of his case through her legal contacts, learning about the settlement that had ended his medical certification and essentially made him unemployable in any healthcare-related field. "I think about him sometimes," Amanda admitted carefully. "I hope he's doing well." "I want to find him," Victoria said with the determined tone that Amanda recognized as a precursor to relentless persistence. "I want to thank him properly and tell him that I remember what he did. I remember how brave he was when everyone else was just standing around talking." Amanda felt the familiar weight of guilt settling across her shoulders. Her daughter's assessment of the rescue was painfully accurate. Robert Smith had acted with courage while others had debated protocol, and he had been punished for that courage, while the people he'd saved had remained safely anonymous behind legal barriers. "Finding people from that long ago can be complicated, sweetheart. A lot of time has passed. But not impossible, right? I mean, he must still live somewhere around here. He must be working somewhere." Victoria's eyes lit up with the analytical excitement she inherited from both parents. Maybe he's still a paramedic, or maybe he became a doctor, or maybe he's teaching other people how to save lives. Each suggestion felt like another knife twist to Amanda's conscience. She knew exactly where Robert Smith was, or at least where he would be tomorrow morning at 10:30, sitting in her office and hoping for a job that would pay him $14 an hour to clean the floors of the building where his heroism had once saved her daughter's life. The cosmic irony of the situation was almost unbearable. Tomorrow, she would face the man whose career she had helped destroy, and he would have no way of knowing that the CEO evaluating his application for custodial work was the mother of the child he had risked everything to save. "We'll talk more about this later," Amanda said, kissing Victoria's forehead and trying to maintain the calm demeanor that had carried her through countless difficult conversations. "Right now, you should focus on finishing your homework. As Victoria returned to her assignments, Amanda retreated to her home office and closed the door. Tomorrow's meeting would require her to confront choices she had spent 4 years trying to justify, and she had no idea how to face the man who represented both her daughter's salvation and her own greatest moral failure. Outside, the early October evening carried the crisp promise of winter, and two families prepared for a convergence that would force them to confront the intersection of justice, gratitude, and the complicated mathematics of doing the right thing when the cost seems impossibly high. The elevator ride to the 16th floor of Meridian Industries felt like ascending toward an execution rather than a job interview. Robert Smith adjusted his tie for the third time, the same borrowed piece of formal wear that had served him through 6 months of unsuccessful job applications. His reflection in the polished elevator doors showed a man who looked professional enough for custodial work, but carried the subtle tension of someone expecting the worst possible outcome. At exactly 10:30, he knocked on the frosted glass door marked, "Dr. Amanda Hartwell, Chief Executive Officer." The voice that called him to enter was crisp and professional, betraying nothing of the emotional turmoil that had kept its owner awake most of the previous night. Amanda Hartwell sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, her attention focused on a manila folder that Robert assumed contained his employment application and background check results. She was younger than he had expected for a CEO, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of controlled composure that spoke of years navigating high-stakes professional decisions. Her office commanded a spectacular view of downtown Denver, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city skyline like an expensive piece of corporate art. "Mr. Smith, please have a seat," she said without looking up from the folder. "Thank you for coming in on short notice." Robert settled into the leather chair across from her desk, noting the medical diplomas and business awards that lined the walls. This was clearly a woman accustomed to excellence, someone whose standards for performance would be unforgiving even for custodial staff. He wondered what had prompted her personal involvement in what should have been a routine hiring decision. "I've reviewed your application and the initial interview notes from Ms. Walsh," Dr. Hartwell continued, finally raising her eyes to meet his. "Your references speak very highly of your work ethic and reliability. However, I noticed there's a significant gap in your employment history, and your previous experience was in healthcare rather than facility maintenance." The moment their eyes met, Robert felt a strange jolt of recognition that he couldn't immediately place. There was something familiar about Dr. Hartwell's face, something that stirred memories from his former professional life, but the context was all wrong. He had certainly never treated a CEO as a patient, and their social circles would never have intersected under normal circumstances. Amanda, meanwhile, was fighting to maintain her professional composure as she found herself face to face with the man who had haunted her conscience for 4 years. Robert Smith looked older than she remembered, worn down by circumstances she had helped create. But his eyes still carried the steady intelligence that had allowed him to make split-second decisions in life-threatening situations. "The gap in employment was due to a career transition," Robert replied carefully, using the sanitized explanation he had rehearsed for dozens of interviews. "I was working as a paramedic until circumstances required me to pursue other opportunities. I'm looking for stable work that allows me to support my daughter while being present in her life." "A paramedic," Amanda repeated, her voice carefully neutral despite the emotional earthquake those words triggered. "That's quite a change from emergency medical services to facility maintenance. What prompted such a dramatic career shift?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Robert found himself studying Dr. Hartwell's expression for any hint of recognition or judgment. There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't casual curiosity about his employment history, but he couldn't determine whether she was genuinely interested in his background or probing for reasons to disqualify him. "Sometimes circumstances beyond our control force us to make difficult choices," he said finally. "I'm proud of my service as a paramedic, but that chapter of my life is closed. I'm focused on finding steady work that provides for my family." Amanda felt each word like a physical blow, knowing that she was partially responsible for closing that chapter of his life. The man sitting across from her had lost his career because he had chosen to save her daughter's life, and now he was applying for a minimum wage position in the building owned by the family he had rescued. "Your background check revealed some legal issues related to your previous employment," she said, consulting the folder with hands that trembled slightly. "There was a lawsuit and a settlement that resulted in the loss of your medical certification. Can you explain those circumstances?" Robert's jaw tightened at the mention of the lawsuit, the wound still fresh despite the passage of time. He had hoped that his background check would focus on criminal history rather than civil litigation. But apparently Dr. Hartwell's company conducted more thorough investigations than most employers. I was sued by a patient's family after an emergency rescue that involved deviating from standard protocol, he said, his voice carefully controlled. The family claimed that my actions during the rescue caused additional injuries. Rather than fight the case and risk bankrupting my family with legal fees, I agreed to settle and surrender my certification. But did you cause additional injuries? Amanda asked, the question escaping before she could stop herself. Robert looked up sharply at the personal nature of the inquiry. Most employers would have been satisfied with his acknowledgement of the legal settlement. But Dr. Hartwell seemed genuinely interested in the details of what had happened during that rescue. No, ma'am, I did not, he said firmly. I saved a child's life under circumstances where following protocol would have resulted in her death. The family's insurance company needed someone to blame for the medical expenses, and I was an easier target than the drunk driver who caused the accident. The raw honesty in his voice cut through Amanda's professional composure like a knife. Here was the man who had saved Victoria's life, sitting in her office and describing the injustice that had destroyed his career, while she maintained the pretense of being a disinterested employer evaluating his suitability for janitorial work. That must have been a difficult situation, she managed to say. It was the right thing to do, Robert replied without hesitation. I would make the same choice again under the same circumstances. Some things are more important than protocol. The conviction in his voice transported Amanda back to that terrifying night 4 years ago, when she had watched this same man wade into rising floodwater to extract her unconscious daughter from an overturned vehicle. His words now carried the same moral certainty that had driven him to act when others had hesitated, the same principled courage that had cost him everything. Mr. Smith, she said, setting down the folder and trying to find her professional equilibrium, why are you applying for a custodial position? With your medical background and experience, surely there are other opportunities that would better utilize your skills. Robert smiled grimly at the question. Dr. Hartwell, a revoked medical certification makes you unemployable in any healthcare-related field. Insurance companies won't cover you, hospitals won't hire you, and medical schools won't even let you volunteer. When you've been branded as a liability in the profession you've devoted your life to, you learn to be grateful for any honest work that pays the bills. The bitter truth of his situation hit Amanda like a physical assault. She was looking at the human cost of legal decisions made in boardrooms by people who had never risked their lives to save a stranger, people who measured liability in dollars rather than moral courage. The custodial position requires working alone during night shifts, she said, struggling to maintain the interview format while her conscience screamed for her to reveal the truth. You'd be responsible for maintaining cleanliness and security in sensitive areas of our research facility. It's honest work, but it's also invisible work. Most people in this building would never know your name or acknowledge your presence. I'm comfortable with being invisible, Robert replied. I've learned that sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows, where people can't see you or judge your methods. As long as the work serves a purpose and provides for my daughter, I can find dignity in it. His words carried a quiet resignation that spoke of hard-won wisdom about the nature of service and sacrifice. Amanda realized she was looking at a man who had been broken by circumstances she had helped create, yet who retained the fundamental decency that had made him a hero in the first place. I have one final question, Mr. Smith, she said, knowing that what she was about to ask would change everything. Do you ever regret the decision that cost you your career? Do you ever wish you had followed protocol instead of risking everything to save someone else's child? Robert met her gaze directly, his expression reflecting 4 years of pain, loss, and unwavering moral conviction. Never, he said simply. That little girl got to go home to her family because I was willing to break the rules. Whatever price I paid for that outcome was worth paying. I just hope she grew up to be happy and healthy, and that she never knew how much controversy her rescue caused. Amanda felt tears threatening at the edges of her vision as she realized that this man had sacrificed his career without ever knowing that the child he saved had grown into a remarkable young woman who thought about him every day and wanted nothing more than to thank him for his courage. The interview was about to take a turn that neither of them could have anticipated, and Amanda Hartwell was finally going to confront the debt she had owed for 4 years. The silence in Dr. Hartwell's office stretched for nearly 30 seconds as Amanda struggled with the weight of 4 years of suppressed guilt and the impossible decision now confronting her. Robert sat quietly, assuming that his final answer had somehow disqualified him from consideration, while Amanda battled between professional protocol and moral obligation. Finally, she stood and walked to the window, her back to Robert as she gazed out at the Denver skyline. "Mr. Smith, what I'm about to tell you may come as a shock, and I want you to know that it doesn't affect your employment status with this company." Robert felt a familiar chill of apprehension, the same sensation he'd experienced countless times when administrators or lawyers had delivered news that would fundamentally alter his circumstances. "I'm listening, Dr. Hartwell." Amanda turned to face him, her professional composure finally cracking under the pressure of years of accumulated remorse. "The child you saved 4 years ago in that floodwater, the 10-year-old girl whose rescue cost you your career, that was my daughter, Victoria." The words hit Robert like a physical blow, and for a moment, the carefully maintained emotional barriers he'd constructed around that painful chapter of his life completely collapsed. He stared at Dr. Hartwell with new understanding, seeing for the first time the resemblance between this accomplished executive and the terrified woman he remembered being extracted from the overturned vehicle that night. "Your daughter," he repeated slowly, his mind struggling to process the implications of this revelation. "Victoria Hartwell. How is she?" "She's 14 now, healthy and strong, and she thinks about you every day," Amanda said, her voice thick with emotion. "She never understood why the adults punished the man who saved her life, and she's been asking to find you so she can thank you properly." Robert leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the cosmic irony of the situation. The mother of the child he'd saved was now interviewing him for a custodial position, 4 years after her insurance company had destroyed his career in the name of liability management. "Dr. Hartwell," he said carefully, "I need to understand something. Are you offering me this job because of who I am or despite who I am?" Amanda moved back to her desk but remained standing, her hands gripping the back of her chair. "I'm offering you this job because you're qualified for it, and because you deserve the chance to rebuild your life, but I'm also offering you something else. The opportunity to meet Victoria again, to see for yourself that your sacrifice meant something." "My sacrifice," Robert repeated, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. "Is that what we're calling it now? I was sued into oblivion by your insurance company, Dr. Hartwell. My reputation was destroyed, my career ended, and my family's financial security was wiped out. Are you telling me you knew about this the entire time?" The accusation hung in the air between them, and Amanda felt the full weight of her moral failure settling on her shoulders. "I knew," she admitted quietly. "I knew the lawsuit was wrong. I knew you had saved Victoria's life, and I knew that challenging the insurance company would have meant accepting personal liability for millions in medical expenses." Robert stood up abruptly, his calm demeanor finally cracking under the pressure of this revelation. "So you let them destroy me to protect your own financial interests. You let them paint me as a reckless cowboy who endangered your daughter when you knew I was the only reason she survived that night." "I was trapped," Amanda said, her voice breaking. "If I had refused to cooperate with the insurance company, Victoria would have lost access to the specialized care she needed during her recovery. I had to choose between protecting the man who saved her life and ensuring she had the medical support necessary to heal completely." "And you chose your daughter," Robert said, his anger giving way to a deeper understanding of the impossible position she'd been placed in. "Any parent would have made the same choice." "That doesn't make it right," Amanda replied, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I've spent 4 years building this company and developing emergency medical technologies, trying to find some way to atone for what I allowed to happen to you. Every device we create, every innovation that helps save lives in emergency situations, feels like a small payment on an impossible debt." Robert walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he processed this information. Below them, the city continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the extraordinary conversation taking place 16 floors above the street level. "She really thinks about me?" he asked after a long pause. "Every day," Amanda confirmed. "She has dreams about the rescue, and she's been asking more and more questions about finding you. She wants to understand why the adults were angry at you for helping her, and she wants to thank you for being brave when everyone else was scared." Robert turned back to face Amanda, seeing her now not as the powerful CEO who controlled his employment fate, but as a mother who had been forced to make an impossible choice between competing moral obligations. "What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Hartwell?" "Because I have to tell you, I'm not interested in being anyone's charity case or symbolic gesture of corporate atonement." Amanda wiped her eyes and took a deep breath, her executive composure gradually returning as she shifted into problem-solving mode. "I'm proposing that we start with honesty. Take the custodial job if you want it. The pay is what it is, and the work is what it is. No special treatment, no shortcuts, no attempts to assuage my guilt through preferential employment policies." She paused, consulting a folder on her desk. "But I'm also proposing that we explore other possibilities. Your background check revealed that you were only 18 months away from completing your physician assistant certification when the lawsuit began. Meridian Industries has partnerships with several medical schools, and we provide educational assistance to employees who want to advance their careers." Robert felt a surge of hope that he immediately tried to suppress. "Dr. Hartwell, I appreciate the gesture, but my certification was permanently revoked. I can't practice emergency medicine in any capacity." "Emergency medicine isn't the only field that benefits from your experience," Amanda replied. "Medical device development, emergency response training, healthcare administration. There are dozens of ways to use your knowledge and skills without directly treating patients. And frankly, this company could benefit from someone who understands emergency medicine from the ground up." The offer was more generous than anything Robert had dared to hope for, but he found himself hesitating. "What about Victoria? How do we handle that situation?" Amanda smiled for the first time since the interview had begun. "We handle it honestly. You saved her life, she wants to thank you. And I want her to meet the man who gave her a future. If you're comfortable with it, I'd like to invite you and your daughter to dinner this weekend. No corporate politics, no complicated explanations. Just two families sharing a meal and acknowledging a debt that can never be fully repaid." Robert considered the proposal, weighing the risks and benefits of reopening a chapter of his life that had caused so much pain. "My daughter Catalina doesn't know the details of what happened with the lawsuit. She knows I used to be a paramedic, and she knows something went wrong that forced me to change careers, but I've never told her about the legal proceedings." "Then maybe it's time she learned that her father is a hero," Amanda said gently. "And maybe it's time Victoria learned that heroes sometimes pay a price for doing the right thing." The conversation had transformed from a routine employment interview into something far more significant. A reckoning with choices made under impossible circumstances, and the beginning of a healing process that had been 4 years in the making. Robert extended his hand across the desk. "Dr. Hartwell, I accept your job offer, and I accept your dinner invitation. But I want to be clear about something. I didn't save Victoria's life looking for gratitude or compensation. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and that hasn't changed." Amanda shook his hand, feeling for the first time in 4 years that she might be able to find peace with the choices she'd been forced to make. "I understand, Mr. Smith, and I want you to know that Victoria grew up believing in heroes because of what you did that night. That's a gift that goes far beyond anything money could buy." As Robert left her office to complete his employment paperwork, Amanda sat alone with the profound realization that the universe had just provided her with an opportunity to transform a moral failure into something approaching redemption. The man she had failed to protect was about to become not just an employee, but potentially the catalyst for healing that both families desperately needed. The 3 days between Robert's revelation meeting with Dr. Hartwell and the planned dinner felt like the longest 72 hours of his adult life. Every conversation with Catalina became a careful navigation between honesty and protection, as he struggled to find age-appropriate ways to explain that their weekend dinner guests were connected to the most painful chapter of his professional life. "Papa, you seem different since your meeting at the new job," Catalina observed over breakfast on Friday morning, her 12-year-old intuition cutting through his attempts at normalcy. "Not bad different, but like you're thinking about something really important all the time." Robert set down his coffee cup and studied his daughter's face, seeing his own analytical nature reflected in her thoughtful expression. "I learned something unexpected at work this week, Mija, something that connects to my old job as a paramedic." "Good unexpected or scary unexpected?" "Both, maybe," he admitted. "Do you remember how I told you that I stopped being a paramedic because of a complicated situation with a patient's family?" Catalina nodded solemnly. She had never pressed for details about her father's career change, sensing that the topic carried emotional weight that he wasn't ready to share. But she had always been curious about the circumstances that had transformed him from someone who saved lives to someone who struggled to find steady employment. "The family I helped, the little girl I rescued from a car accident, they want to meet us for dinner this weekend. The girl is about your age now, and her mother runs the company where I just got hired." Catalina's eyes widened with the kind of excitement that only comes from discovering that real life sometimes contains the dramatic coincidences usually reserved for movies. "The girl you saved is going to be at dinner? Papa, that's amazing. She gets to thank you in person." Robert smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm, wishing he could share her uncomplicated joy about the reunion. "It's complicated, sweetheart. After I helped her, there were some legal problems that made it difficult for me to continue working as a paramedic. Adult situations that aren't anyone's fault, but that changed our lives in ways that were hard to handle." "But you saved her life, right? You did the right thing?" "Yes, I did the right thing." "Then everything else doesn't matter," Catalina declared with the moral certainty that only children possess. "She's alive because of you, and now we get to meet her and her family. That's wonderful." Robert marveled at his daughter's ability to cut through complicated emotional terrain and focus on the essential truth of the situation. Her perspective reminded him of why he had become a paramedic in the first place, not for recognition or career advancement, but because helping people in crisis was simply the right thing to do. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Hartwell was experiencing her own complicated mix of anticipation and nervousness as her mother attempted to explain the extraordinary coincidence that had brought Robert Smith into their lives. "Mom, are you absolutely certain this is the same paramedic who saved me?" Victoria asked for the third time that morning, pacing around the kitchen while Amanda prepared breakfast with unusual attention to detail, a sure sign that she was managing her own anxiety about the upcoming dinner. "I'm certain, sweetheart. I recognized him the moment he walked into my office, even though he looks older now. And when he described the rescue, every detail matched exactly what I remembered from that night." Victoria stopped pacing and turned to face her mother with the serious expression she wore when processing information that would reshape her understanding of the world. "So he lost his job because of us? Because of the lawsuit?" Amanda set down her coffee mug and chose her words carefully. "He lost his job because our insurance company decided to blame him for your injuries instead of accepting responsibility for covering your medical care. It wasn't our choice, but it wasn't his fault either." "That's not fair," Victoria said, her voice carrying the indignation of someone who had inherited her mother's sense of justice. "He saved my life, and they punished him for it. How is that even possible?" "Sometimes adult decisions are based on money and legal liability instead of what's right and wrong," Amanda explained. "The insurance company needed someone to blame for the expensive medical treatment you needed, and it was easier to blame the paramedic than to admit that the drunk driver should have been held responsible for all the costs." Victoria absorbed this information with the same analytical approach she applied to her school assignments, but her emotional response was immediate and fierce. "I want to tell him I'm sorry that happened to him. I want him to know that I never forgot what he did, and that I think the adults who punished him were wrong." "You'll have that chance tomorrow night," Amanda assured her. "He's bringing his daughter, who's about your age. Her name is Catalina, and her father has been raising her alone since her mother died." "He's a single parent too?" "Yes, just like us." Victoria nodded thoughtfully, already beginning to construct a mental picture of the man who had shaped her understanding of courage, and the family whose lives had been intertwined with theirs through circumstances neither could have predicted. Saturday evening arrived with the crisp clarity of October in Colorado, and Robert found himself standing outside an elegant townhouse in Cherry Creek, holding a bottle of wine that had consumed half of his weekly grocery budget and wondering if he was making a terrible mistake. Catalina stood beside him in her best dress, practically vibrating with excitement about meeting the girl her father had rescued. She had spent the afternoon asking detailed questions about the rescue that Robert had answered with the clinical precision of someone determined to focus on facts rather than emotions. "Remember, Misha," he said as they approached the front door, "this might be emotionally complicated for everyone involved. We should be polite and respectful, but we don't need to pretend that everything is simple or easy." Before Catalina could respond, the door opened to reveal Amanda Hartwell, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater that made her look more like a suburban mother than a corporate executive. Behind her stood a tall, confident teenager with dark hair and her mother's intelligent eyes. "Mr. Smith, Catalina, welcome," Amanda said, stepping aside to invite them in. "This is my daughter Victoria." For a moment, everyone stood in the entryway in awkward silence, the weight of history and emotion making casual conversation seem impossible. Then Victoria stepped forward with the kind of direct honesty that had characterized her approach to life since childhood. "Mr. Smith," she said, extending her hand with formal politeness, "I want to thank you for saving my life 4 years ago. I know that helping me caused problems for you and your family, and I want you to know that I think about what you did all the time. You're the reason I got to grow up." Robert felt his carefully maintained emotional composure crack at the edges as he looked into the face of the child he had pulled from that flooding vehicle. Victoria had grown into a remarkable young woman, confident and articulate, with the kind of inner strength that suggested she had used her second chance at life to become someone extraordinary. "Victoria," he said quietly, "seeing you healthy and strong is the only thanks I've ever needed. What happened afterward wasn't your fault or your mother's fault. It was just one of those complicated adult situations that sometimes happen when people try to do the right thing." "But it wasn't fair," Victoria insisted, her voice carrying 4 years of suppressed indignation. "You risked your life to save mine, and they punished you for breaking rules that would have let me die. I've wanted to find you for years just to tell you that I know the difference between right and wrong, and what you did was right." Catalina watched this exchange with fascination, seeing her father through new eyes as she witnessed the impact of his heroism on someone whose life he had literally saved. The abstract concept of her father as a former paramedic suddenly became concrete and immediate as she observed the gratitude and respect in Victoria's voice. Amanda cleared her throat gently, sensing that the emotional intensity of the reunion needed to be balanced with practical hospitality. "Why don't we move to the living room? Dinner will be ready in about an hour, and I thought we could talk more comfortably there." As they settled into the warmly decorated living room, Robert found himself studying the family photographs that lined the mantelpiece, seeing images of Victoria growing up, birthday parties, school events, family vacations, all the moments that might never have happened if he had followed protocol that night, instead of trusting his instincts. The evening ahead would require all 4 of them to navigate emotions they had carried alone for years, but for the first time since that March night 4 years ago, Robert Smith felt that his sacrifice might finally be transformed into something approaching redemption. Yearben. Dinner at the Hartwell house unfolded with the careful choreography of 4 people, determined to transform years of suppressed emotion into honest conversation. Amanda had prepared a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables, understanding that the evening's real nourishment would come from finally speaking truths that had been buried under legal complications and social awkwardness. As they settled around the dining room table, Victoria took charge of the conversation with the directness that had become her trademark approach to difficult situations. "Mr. Smith, I want to understand exactly what happened after you saved me. Mom explained some of it, but I want to hear it from you." Robert glanced at Amanda, who nodded encouragingly, then looked at his own daughter. Catalina was listening with the intense focus she reserved for subjects that would expand her understanding of her father's mysterious past. "After the rescue, there was an investigation," Robert began, choosing his words carefully. "Anytime a paramedic deviates from standard protocol, the department has to review whether proper procedures were followed. In your case, the protocol was to wait for specialized extraction equipment before attempting to remove you from the vehicle." "But the water was rising," Victoria said, her memory of that night becoming clearer as she grew older. "I remember feeling the water getting higher around me. If you had waited for equipment, I would have drowned." "That's correct," Robert confirmed. "The water was rising faster than anyone anticipated, and you were losing consciousness. Waiting for proper equipment would have meant waiting too long." Amanda set down her fork, her appetite diminished by the weight of memories she had tried to suppress. The insurance company's lawyers argued that Robert's decision to enter the vehicle without proper equipment actually caused additional injuries during the extraction process. They claimed that following protocol would have achieved the same result without the minor spinal compression you experienced. Catalina looked up from her plate with confusion. "But Papa, if she would have drowned, how could following the rules have achieved the same result?" "It couldn't have," Robert replied simply. "The lawyers were more concerned with minimizing their client's financial liability than with acknowledging the reality of the situation. It was easier to blame me for the medical expenses than to hold the drunk driver responsible for all the costs associated with the accident." Victoria's face flushed with anger that had been building for 4 years. So they lied? They knew you saved my life, but they said you hurt me instead? Amanda nodded reluctantly. The legal system sometimes forces people to make arguments that don't reflect the whole truth. Our insurance company needed to minimize their financial exposure, and the easiest way to do that was to claim that the rescue itself caused preventable injuries. But you could have told them they were wrong, Victoria pressed, her analytical mind working through the logical implications. You were there, Mom. You saw what happened. You could have testified that Mr. Smith saved my life. The question that Amanda had been dreading for 4 years hung in the air like an accusation. She looked at Robert, seeking some guidance about how much truth a 14-year-old could handle, but his expression suggested that Victoria deserved complete honesty. I could have challenged the insurance company's version of events, Amanda admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But doing so would have meant accepting personal liability for all your medical expenses. The specialized care you needed during your recovery cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. If I had refused to cooperate with their legal strategy, we would have been financially responsible for those costs. Victoria stared at her mother with dawning comprehension. You had to choose between protecting Mr. Smith and protecting our family financially. Yes. And you chose us. Yes. The simple acknowledgement of that impossible choice settled over the dinner table like a heavy blanket. Robert watched Victoria process this information with the same systematic approach he had seen her apply to her gratitude, but now tinged with the complexity of understanding adult moral compromises. I would have made the same choice, Robert said quietly, breaking the silence. Any parent would have chosen their child's welfare over protecting a stranger. That's not something to feel guilty about, Dr. Hartwell. That's just being a good mother. Amanda felt tears threatening at the edges of her vision. But it wasn't right. You lost your career because you saved Victoria's life, and I was too much of a coward to stand up for you when it mattered. You weren't a coward, Robert insisted. You were a mother faced with an impossible situation created by people who cared more about money than justice. The real cowardice belonged to the insurance executives who decided to destroy a paramedic's career rather than acknowledge their responsibility to cover a child's medical care. Catalina had been listening to this exchange with growing indignation. Papa, this is so unfair. You saved someone's life, and they punished you for it. How was that even legal? Sometimes legal and right aren't the same thing, Meja, Robert explained. The legal system is supposed to determine truth and assign responsibility, but sometimes it gets distorted by people who care more about money than justice. Victoria pushed her plate away, her appetite gone, as she contemplated the injustice that had shaped her family's relationship with the man who had given her a future. Mr. Smith, I want to do something to fix this. I don't know what, but there has to be some way to make this right. Robert smiled at her determination, recognizing the same moral conviction that had driven her to seek him out in the first place. Victoria, seeing you healthy and strong, watching you grow into someone who cares about justice and fairness, that's already making it right. You can't change what happened to my career, but you can live a life that honors the second chance you were given. But it's not enough, Victoria protested. You should be working as a paramedic or a doctor or something that uses your skills to help people. Instead, you're cleaning offices, because adults made terrible decisions about money. Amanda had been silent during this exchange, but now she leaned forward with the decisive expression that her employees recognized as a precursor to major policy announcements. Actually, Victoria, there might be something we can do about that. Robert looked at her with curiosity mixed with wariness. Dr. Hartwell, I thought we agreed that I would take the custodial position without any special treatment. The custodial position is still yours if you want it, Amanda assured him, but I've been thinking about our conversation regarding educational opportunities. Meridian Industries has partnerships with several universities that offer degree programs in healthcare administration, medical technology development, and emergency services management. None of those fields require active medical certification, but all of them would benefit enormously from your practical experience. She pulled out a folder that she had apparently prepared before dinner. I've researched the requirements for several programs that would allow you to use your medical background in ways that don't involve direct patient care, emergency response training, medical device testing, healthcare policy development. There are dozens of ways to contribute to the medical field without being a practicing paramedic. Robert examined the materials she had prepared, seeing opportunities he had never considered during his months of desperate job searching. "These programs are expensive, Dr. Hartwell. Even with employee assistance, I couldn't afford the tuition while supporting Catalina." Meridian Industries provides full educational assistance to employees who commit to working for the company for 3 years after graduation, Amanda explained. "Your salary would continue during your studies, and all tuition and fees would be covered. You'd be able to support your family while preparing for a career that actually uses your expertise." Victoria clapped her hands together with excitement. "Papa," she said, forgetting herself in her enthusiasm and using Catalina's term of address, "this could be perfect. You could go back to helping people, just in a different way." Catalina looked at her father with hopeful eyes. "Would you want to do that, Papa? Go back to school and work in medicine again?" Robert felt a stirring of professional ambition that he had suppressed for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to envision a meaningful career future. "I would need to think about it carefully. Going back to school while working and raising you would be challenging, but possible," Amanda added. "And more importantly, it would be a way to transform what happened to you from a career-ending tragedy into the foundation for something even better. You could help design the emergency response systems that prevent other paramedics from facing the same impossible choices you faced." The conversation had evolved from a simple dinner invitation into something approaching a complete life transformation, and Robert found himself simultaneously excited and terrified by the possibilities Amanda was presenting. The evening was becoming a turning point not just for the healing of old wounds, but for the creation of entirely new possibilities that none of them could have imagined when they first sat down to dinner. The weeks following the dinner at the Hartwell house brought changes to Robert's life that felt both overwhelming and miraculous. Within 5 days of their conversation, Amanda had arranged for him to meet with the admissions coordinator at the University of Colorado's Healthcare Administration program, where his combination of medical experience and military background made him an ideal candidate for their accelerated degree track. By the end of October, Robert found himself navigating 2 parallel existences, working the night shift as custodial staff at Meridian Industries while attending day classes in healthcare policy, medical ethics, and emergency services management. The schedule was exhausting, but for the first time in 4 years, he felt like he was moving toward a future that honored both his expertise and his desire to serve others. Catalina had adapted to her father's new routine with the resilience that had carried her through their most difficult periods. She did homework at the kitchen table while he studied for midterm exams, and she had begun showing genuine interest in the healthcare concepts he discussed during their evening walks. "Papa, in your medical ethics class, do they talk about situations like what happened to you?" she asked one evening as they walked through their neighborhood park. "Like when doing the right thing gets you in trouble with the rules?" Robert smiled at his daughter's ability to distill complex philosophical concepts into practical questions. "Actually, yes. There's an entire section on moral courage in healthcare settings. It turns out that situations like mine are more common than most people realize." "Really? Other paramedics have gotten in trouble for saving people?" "Not just paramedics. Doctors, nurses, medical technicians. Anyone who works in emergency medicine eventually faces situations where following protocol might not be the best thing for the patient. The question is whether you have the courage to do what's right when it might cost you personally." Catalina nodded thoughtfully. "Victoria says her mom has been different since you started working at the company. Happier, but also more serious about making sure the company does things the right way." The friendship that had developed between Catalina and Victoria had been one of the unexpected benefits of the adults' reconciliation. Despite their 2-year age difference, the girls had bonded over their shared experience of being raised by single parents and their mutual pride in their fathers' and mothers' professional accomplishments. Victoria had become a regular presence at their apartment, often staying for dinner after school while Amanda worked late at the office. Her presence had brought a new energy to their small household, and Robert found himself enjoying the role of unofficial mentor to both girls as they worked on science projects and discussed their career aspirations. "Victoria's right about her mother," Robert told Catalina. "Dr. Hartwell has been implementing new policies at Meridian Industries that prioritize ethical decision-making over pure profit maximization. She's turning the company into a model for how healthcare businesses can balance financial responsibility with moral obligation." What Robert didn't mention to his daughter was the series of private conversations he'd been having with Amanda about the broader implications of his case. Their dinner table revelation had sparked something deeper than personal healing. It had ignited Amanda's determination to address the systemic problems that had made his career destruction possible. 3 weeks into November, Amanda called Robert into her office for what she described as an important discussion about corporate policy. He arrived to find her accompanied by 2 people he didn't recognize: a middle-aged woman in a conservative business suit and a younger man with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to media attention. "Robert, I'd like you to meet Sarah Chin, our corporate legal counsel, and Marcus Webb, who works with the Denver Post's investigative journalism team," Amanda said, gesturing for him to take a seat at the conference table. "I've been discussing your case with them, and we think there's an opportunity to address some of the systemic issues that led to your situation." Robert felt a familiar wariness at the mention of legal counsel and journalists. His experience with both professions had not been positive, and he wasn't eager to revisit the painful details of his lawsuit for public consumption. "Dr. Hartwell, I appreciate your interest in broader policy issues, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable with making my case a public matter. I've moved on from what happened, and I'd prefer to keep it that way." Sarah Chen leaned forward with the careful manner of someone accustomed to dealing with reluctant witnesses. "Mr. Smith, I understand your hesitation, but your case represents a pattern of behavior by insurance companies that's affecting emergency responders across the country. We've identified at least 12 similar cases in the past 5 years where paramedics and EMTs have been scapegoated for insurance liability purposes." Marcus Webb opened a laptop and turned it toward Robert. "These are just the cases we've been able to document. There are probably dozens more where emergency responders accepted settlements quietly, rather than fighting the charges publicly." Robert studied the screen, seeing photographs and brief case summaries of men and women whose stories echoed his own experience. Paramedics who had saved lives under extraordinary circumstances, only to find themselves sued by insurance companies looking to minimize their financial exposure. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked cautiously. Amanda answered with the decisive tone he had learned to associate with her major business decisions. "We're proposing to fund a legal challenge to the practice of using emergency responders as scapegoats for insurance liability. Sarah has identified several cases where the settlements could be challenged on the grounds that the insurance companies engaged in fraudulent misrepresentation of the facts. Including your case," Sarah added, "the evidence from your rescue is documented extensively in police reports, fire department records, and hospital admission notes. All of that evidence supports your version of events rather than the insurance company's claims." Marcus Webb leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who had found a story worth telling. "More importantly, your case has a compelling human element that would help the public understand how these insurance practices affect real families. You're not just a paramedic who got sued. You're a single father who sacrificed his career to save a child's life, and who's now rebuilding that career through the generosity of the family he rescued." Robert looked at Amanda with new understanding of the scope of what she was proposing. "Dr. Hartwell, this isn't just about clearing my name. You're talking about challenging an entire industry practice." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Amanda confirmed. "I've spent 4 years feeling guilty about what happened to you. But guilt without action is just self-indulgence. If we can use your case to change the system that destroyed your career, then maybe we can prevent other families from going through what you and Catalina experienced." The proposal was both exciting and terrifying in its implications. Robert had spent 4 years trying to rebuild his life quietly, avoiding attention and focusing on providing stability for his daughter. The idea of becoming the public face of a campaign against insurance industry practices felt like stepping into a spotlight that could either vindicate him completely or expose him to new forms of attack. "I need to think about this," he said finally, "and I need to discuss it with Catalina. She's been through enough disruption in her life, and I won't make decisions that could affect her without her input." "Of course," Amanda agreed. "Take whatever time you need. But I want you to know that Meridian Industries is prepared to provide full legal and financial support for this challenge, regardless of whether you decide to participate publicly." As Robert left the meeting, his mind raced with the possibilities and risks that Amanda's proposal represented. The opportunity to transform his personal tragedy into a force for systemic change was compelling, but it would require him to relive the most painful period of his life in a very public forum. The conversation with Catalina that evening would determine whether Robert Smith was ready to step out of the shadows and reclaim not just his own reputation, but his role as an advocate for the principles that had made him a hero in the first place. The conversation with Catalina took place over pizza at their small kitchen table on a Thursday evening in late November, with the early winter darkness pressing against the apartment windows and the comfortable sounds of their neighborhood settling into evening routines. Robert had rehearsed various approaches to explaining Amanda's proposal, but ultimately decided that his daughter deserved the same direct honesty that had characterized all their discussions about difficult topics. "Mija, Dr. Hartwell and some lawyers want to use my case to help other paramedics who got in trouble for doing the right thing," he began, watching Catalina's face carefully for signs of anxiety or confusion. "It would mean talking to reporters and maybe going to court to prove that the insurance company lied about what happened when I saved Victoria." Catalina set down her slice of pizza and considered this information with the serious expression she wore when processing concepts that would reshape her understanding of their family's circumstances. "Would it help people like you? Other paramedics who saved people and got punished for it?" "Yes, it could help prevent other families from going through what we went through." "And would it clear your name? Would people know that you're a hero instead of thinking you did something wrong?" Robert smiled at his daughter's ability to identify the essential elements of a complex situation. "It might, but it would also mean that our story would be in newspapers and on television. People we don't know would learn about our private business, and they might have opinions about decisions I made." Catalina pushed her plate aside and leaned forward with the intense focus she brought to important conversations. "Papa, do you remember what you told me about doing the right thing even when it's scary?" "I remember. You said that sometimes being scared is how you know something is really important, because if it wasn't important, you wouldn't be scared of messing it up." Robert felt a surge of pride at his daughter's ability to apply moral reasoning to practical situations. At 13, she possessed a clarity of ethical thinking that had taken him decades to develop. "That's right, but this decision affects both of us, not just me. If we do this, it means reporters might want to interview you too, and kids at school might ask questions about our family that you don't want to answer." Catalina was quiet for several minutes, her expression cycling through various considerations that Robert couldn't read. Finally, she looked up with the determined expression that he recognized as a precursor to decisions that couldn't be changed. "Papa, Victoria told me that her mom has been having nightmares about what happened to you. She feels guilty because she didn't protect you when the lawyers were being mean. Is that true?" Robert nodded, surprised by the depth of communication between the two girls. "Dr. Hartwell feels responsible for not standing up for me during the lawsuit, even though she was in an impossible situation. And you feel bad because your career got destroyed for saving someone's life?" "Yes." "And there are other paramedics who feel bad because the same thing happened to them." "That's right." Catalina stood up and walked to the living room window, looking out at the street where they had walked together through the most difficult periods of their lives. When she turned back to face her father, her expression carried a determination that reminded him powerfully of her late mother. "Papa, I think we should do it. Not because it will make us famous or because it will get you money, but because it's the right thing to do. You taught me that heroes aren't people who never get scared. They're people who do the right thing even when they are scared." The simple wisdom of her response hit Robert like a revelation. His 13-year-old daughter had understood something that had taken him months to recognize, that healing from injustice sometimes required the courage to risk new forms of vulnerability in service of preventing others from experiencing the same harm. "Are you sure, Mija, once we say yes to this, there's no going back to being invisible?" "I'm sure. And Papa? I think it's time for people to know that you're a hero. I've known it my whole life, but maybe other people should know it too." The next morning, Robert called Amanda's office and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. When he arrived, he found her alone, reviewing what appeared to be legal documents spread across her conference table. "I've made my decision," he said without preamble. "Catalina and I are willing to participate in whatever legal challenge you think will be most effective. But I have some conditions." Amanda looked up with the focused attention she brought to important negotiations. "I'm listening." "First, I want complete control over any media interviews involving my daughter. She's willing to participate, but only in ways that I approve in advance." "Agreed." "Second, I want the legal strategy to focus on systemic change rather than personal vindication. I don't need to be declared innocent. I need other paramedics to be protected from what happened to me." That's exactly what Sarah Chen has recommended. The strongest legal approach focuses on challenging the insurance industry's pattern of behavior rather than relitigating individual cases. Robert took a deep breath before stating his final condition. Third, I want Victoria to be involved in the advocacy effort in whatever way she's comfortable with. This story belongs to both our families, and she has as much right to tell her version of what happened as I do. Amanda smiled for the first time since he'd entered her office. Victoria has already asked to be involved. She wants to testify about what she remembers from the rescue and what she's learned about the legal aftermath. She's particularly interested in speaking to other young people about the importance of supporting first responders. Then we're all in agreement. Amanda stood and extended her hand across the conference table. Robert, I want you to know that whatever happens with the legal challenge, you've already given me something I thought I'd lost forever. The ability to live with myself knowing that I finally did the right thing. Their handshake felt like the culmination of a journey that had begun 4 years earlier in floodwater and legal documents, and was now evolving into something that could transform how society treats the people who risk their lives to save others. Over the following weeks, Robert found himself adapting to yet another new identity, from invisible custodian to reluctant public advocate. Sarah Chen began preparing him for depositions and media interviews, while Marcus Webb worked on crafting a narrative that would help the public understand the human cost of insurance industry practices. The transformation was both exhilarating and exhausting. Robert's night shift duties at Meridian Industries remained unchanged, but his days were now filled with legal meetings, interview preparation, and the kind of public attention he had spent 4 years trying to avoid. Catalina adapted to their new circumstances with the same resilience she had shown throughout their most difficult periods. She began accompanying Robert to selected meetings, offering insights that surprised the adults with their clarity and moral conviction. "Mr. Webb," she said during one strategy session, "when you write about my papa, make sure you mention that he never stopped helping people, even after he lost his job as a paramedic. He helps me with my homework, he helps our neighbors when they need things fixed, and he helps other students in his college classes. Being a hero isn't just about the big dramatic moments. It's about choosing to help people every single day." The observation became a cornerstone of the media strategy, highlighting not just Robert's moment of courage during Victoria's rescue, but his continued commitment to service, despite the personal cost he had paid for his heroism. As December approached and the legal challenge gained momentum, Robert realized that his journey from paramedic to custodian to student to advocate had prepared him for a role he had never imagined, becoming a voice for the principle that doing the right thing should be supported rather than punished, even when, especially when, it requires the courage to break rules that prioritize procedure over human life. The Denver Post's investigative series, Heroes Under Fire: How Insurance Companies Punish Emergency Responders, launched on a cold Monday morning in January, with Robert Smith's story as the centerpiece of a 3-part exposé that would ultimately reshape public understanding of the challenges facing first responders across the country. Marcus Webb had crafted the narrative with surgical precision, weaving together Robert's personal journey with broader data about insurance industry practices and their impact on emergency medical services. The first article opened with a photograph of Robert in his Meridian Industries custodial uniform, standing beside a framed certificate from his paramedic training, while the caption read, "Robert Smith lost his career for saving a child's life. Now he's fighting to ensure other heroes don't face the same fate." The public response was immediate and overwhelming. By noon on the day of publication, Robert's phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters, fellow emergency responders, and strangers who wanted to express their support for his cause. The Denver Post's website crashed twice from traffic volume, and the hashtag #HeroesUnderFire began trending on social media platforms across the state. "Papa, you're famous," Catalina announced that evening, showing him her laptop screen filled with supportive comments from people who had read their story. "Look at all these paramedics and EMTs saying thank you for speaking up. They're sharing their own stories about getting in trouble for helping people." Robert scrolled through the responses with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, seeing dozens of cases that mirrored his own experience. Emergency responders from across the country were sharing stories of lawsuits, career destruction, and families torn apart by insurance companies that prioritized profit over justice. The legal challenge that Sarah Chen had been preparing gained momentum as additional plaintiffs emerged from the media coverage. Within 2 weeks of the article's publication, she had documented 17 cases of emergency responders who had been scapegoated by insurance companies, creating the foundation for a class action lawsuit that could fundamentally change how such cases were handled. Amanda found herself thrust into an unexpected role as the public face of corporate responsibility, fielding interview requests from business magazines and healthcare publications that wanted to understand why a CEO would fund a legal challenge that could ultimately increase insurance costs for her own industry. Dr. Hartwell, some critics argue that your support for this lawsuit is motivated by guilt rather than genuine policy concerns, asked a reporter from Healthcare Business Weekly during a live interview. How do you respond to suggestions that you're simply trying to ease your conscience about your family's role in Mr. Smith's career destruction? Amanda had prepared for this question, but answering it still required her to navigate the complicated intersection of personal guilt and professional conviction. My family's experience with Mr. Smith's case certainly motivated my initial interest in this issue, she replied carefully. But the data that our legal team has compiled shows that this isn't about one family's guilt. It's about a systemic problem that's affecting emergency responders nationwide. Insurance companies are using first responders as scapegoats to avoid paying legitimate claims, and that practice is making our communities less safe by discouraging the kind of quick decision-making that saves lives. The interview continued for 20 minutes, with Amanda articulating a vision of healthcare accountability that impressed even her critics. By the time it aired, she had become a recognized voice for the principle that corporate responsibility sometimes required challenging industry practices that prioritized profit over ethical behavior. Meanwhile, Victoria had begun her own advocacy journey, speaking to high school groups about the importance of supporting first responders and the complex moral courage required to do the right thing when it comes with personal costs. Her presentations combined the emotional impact of her rescue story with sophisticated analysis of policy issues that impressed educators and students alike. When Mr. Smith pulled me out of that car, he made a choice that saved my life but destroyed his career, she told a packed auditorium at East High School. He knew that breaking protocol might get him in trouble, but he also knew that following protocol would let me drown. That's what real heroes do. They accept personal risk to prevent harm to others. Her speeches invariably ended with a call to action that challenged young people to support policies that protected emergency responders rather than punishing them for making difficult decisions under extreme pressure. The response from students was consistently enthusiastic, with many organizing their own advocacy efforts in support of first responder protection legislation. Robert's own public speaking had evolved from reluctant media interviews to confident presentations at emergency services conferences and policy forums. His combination of practical experience and academic training made him an effective advocate for reforms that would protect future emergency responders from the insurance industry practices that had destroyed his original career. The question isn't whether emergency responders should be held accountable for their decisions, he told a gathering of state legislators considering first responder protection legislation. The question is whether that accountability should be based on the outcomes they achieve or the procedures they follow. If we want paramedics and EMTs to save lives, we have to support them when they make the split-second decisions that actually accomplish that goal. His testimony was credited with helping to pass Colorado's Emergency Responder Protection Act, which created legal safeguards for first responders who deviated from protocol in life-threatening situations. Similar legislation began advancing in other states as the national movement gained momentum. The personal relationship between the Smith and Hartwell families deepened alongside their public advocacy work. Sunday dinners became a regular tradition, with both families gathering to discuss not just their ongoing legal and media campaigns, but also the ordinary concerns of homework, college applications, and career planning that filled their daily lives. Catalina and Victoria had become genuine sisters in all but legal status, supporting each other through the challenges of adolescence while also serving as each other's closest advisors about the unique pressures that came with being the children of public advocates. Their friendship provided both girls with a safe space to discuss the complications of having parents whose personal story had become a matter of national interest. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Papa had just followed the rules that night," Catalina confided to Victoria during one of their weekend sleepovers. "We wouldn't have gone through all the hard times, but you might not be here, and all these other paramedics wouldn't be getting help with their cases." Victoria considered this observation with the analytical approach that had become her trademark response to complex moral questions. "I think your papa would say that we can't choose our moral challenges, but we can choose how we respond to them. He could have stayed bitter about what happened to him, or he could use his experience to help other people. He chose to help." Their conversation reflected a level of moral sophistication that impressed the adults in their lives, suggesting that their shared experience of trauma and recovery had accelerated their development into young women capable of sophisticated ethical reasoning. As spring arrived, and Robert approached the completion of his first year in the healthcare administration program, he found himself contemplating career possibilities that would have seemed impossible during the darkest period of his life. Offers had begun arriving from hospitals, emergency services departments, and policy organizations that wanted to hire someone with his unique combination of practical experience and advocacy expertise. The transformation from invisible custodian to nationally recognized advocate had been complete, but more importantly, the journey had restored Robert's sense of purpose and professional identity in ways that transcended his original career as a paramedic. He had discovered that heroism could take many forms, and that sometimes the most important lives you save are the ones that come after you've lost everything and found the courage to begin again. The Colorado Convention Center buzzed with the energy of 1,000 emergency responders, healthcare professionals, and policy advocates gathered for the first National Emergency Services Ethics Conference, 18 months after Robert Smith's story had ignited a nationwide movement for first responder protection. The event, co-sponsored by Meridian Industries and the National Association of Emergency Medical Technicians, represented the culmination of efforts that had begun in a corporate office where a former paramedic had applied for a custodial position. Robert stood behind the podium on the main stage, no longer the nervous job applicant in a thrift store blazer, but a confident advocate wearing the academic regalia of someone who had just completed his master's degree in healthcare administration with highest honors. The transformation was visible not just in his professional attire, but in the quiet authority he carried as someone who had turned personal tragedy into systemic change. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily across the packed auditorium, 3 years ago I was cleaning floors in the building where I now serve as Director of Emergency Response Ethics. That journey from custodial staff to conference keynote speaker isn't a story about personal redemption. It's a story about what becomes possible when people choose courage over convenience, truth over expediency, and justice over profit. The audience responded with sustained applause that spoke to the recognition he had earned not just as a survivor of insurance industry abuse, but as the architect of legal and policy reforms that had protected hundreds of emergency responders across the country. In the front row, Amanda Hartwell watched with pride that extended far beyond professional satisfaction. Her decision to fund a legal challenge that had vindicated Robert's actions had evolved into a comprehensive corporate initiative that had made Meridian Industries a model for ethical business practices in the healthcare industry. The company's stock price had reached record highs as investors recognized the value of authentic corporate responsibility over mere public relations gestures. Beside Amanda sat Victoria, now 16 and already accepted to pre-med programs at 3 prestigious universities. Her advocacy work with young people had earned her recognition as one of Colorado's outstanding teen leaders, but her most meaningful accomplishment remained the friendship she had built with Catalina, who sat on her other side taking notes for the high school newspaper article she would write about the conference. The Smith-Hartwell Emergency Responder Protection Act, which has now been adopted by 37 states, isn't just about protecting paramedics and EMTs from frivolous lawsuits, Robert continued. It's about creating a legal framework that supports moral courage in crisis situations. When we protect the people who risk their lives to save others, we strengthen the entire foundation of emergency medical services. The legislation that bore both families' names had fundamentally changed how insurance companies could pursue claims against emergency responders, requiring them to prove not just that protocol had been violated, but that the violation had caused preventable harm in situations where following protocol would have led to worse outcomes. Sarah Chen, now serving as General Counsel for the National Emergency Response Legal Defense Fund, had used the class action lawsuit to secure settlements totaling over $40 million for emergency responders who had been unfairly targeted by insurance companies. More importantly, the legal precedents established by the case had made such targeting prohibitively expensive for insurance companies, effectively ending the practice of scapegoating first responders for liability purposes. But legislative victories and legal settlements, while important, aren't the real measure of our success, Robert said, his tone shifting to the more personal register that had made him an effective speaker. The real measure is whether we've created a culture that supports people who choose to help others, even when that choice involves personal risk. He gestured toward the audience, which included dozens of emergency responders whose careers had been saved by the legal protections and advocacy support that had emerged from his case. The men and women in this auditorium represent thousands more who can now focus on saving lives instead of protecting themselves from litigation. That's the legacy I'm most proud of. As the keynote address concluded to another standing ovation, Robert felt the profound satisfaction of someone who had transformed personal suffering into meaningful service. The custodial position that had once represented his fall from grace had become the foundation for a career that honored both his medical expertise and his hard-won understanding of institutional justice. The afternoon breakout sessions featured panels on emergency medical ethics, insurance industry reform, and the role of corporate responsibility in supporting first responders. Victoria moderated a session on next-generation advocacy, where high school and college students discussed strategies for continuing the movement that their families had helped create. The thing people don't understand about heroes, Victoria told her panel audience, is that they're not people who never get scared or never make mistakes. They're people who do the right thing, even when it costs them something important. My life was saved by someone who knew that helping me might destroy his career, and he chose to help me anyway. Catalina, now 15 and already showing the analytical intelligence that would serve her well in whatever career she eventually chose, had become an effective advocate in her own right. Her presentation on Children of Advocates Growing Up in Public Service Families offered insights into the unique challenges and opportunities that came with having parents whose personal experiences had become matters of public policy. Growing up with a father who lost everything for doing the right thing taught me that integrity isn't about avoiding difficult situations, she told the audience. It's about choosing your values over your comfort, even when that choice is really hard. The evening gala that concluded the conference featured the presentation of the Robert Smith Award for Emergency Response Courage, a recognition that would be given annually to first responders who demonstrated exceptional moral courage in crisis situations. The first recipient was Maria Santos, a paramedic from Phoenix who had saved 3 children from a house fire by entering an unstable structure against direct orders from her supervisor. As Robert presented the award that bore his name, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from the lowest point of his life to this moment of professional triumph and personal fulfillment. The award represented not just recognition of his own courage, but the institutionalization of values that would protect future generations of emergency responders from the injustices he had endured. After the formal proceedings concluded, both families gathered in Amanda's hotel suite for a private celebration that had become their tradition after major advocacy milestones. The room filled with laughter as Catalina and Victoria shared stories from the day's events, their friendship having evolved into something that transcended their family's shared history. To think it all started with a custodial job application, Amanda mused, raising her glass in a toast. Robert, you've turned what should have been a routine hiring decision into a movement that's changed how this country treats its heroes. Robert smiled as he looked around the room at the family he had never expected to gain through tragedy and recovery. Dr. Hartwell, I think you have that backward. You could have processed my application quietly and moved on with your life. Instead, you chose to confront an injustice that was easier to ignore. That's the real courage in this story. We all chose courage, Victoria interjected with the wisdom that continued to impress the adults in her life. Dad chose courage when he saved my life. Mom chose courage when she decided to fight the system that hurt him. And Catalina chose courage when she supported taking our story public. Sometimes courage is a moment, and sometimes it's a process. As the evening wound down and both families prepared to return to their regular lives, Robert to his position at Meridian Industries and his adjunct teaching at the university, Amanda to her expanding role as a national voice for corporate ethics, and both girls to the normal challenges of teenage life. They carried with them the knowledge that personal healing could become a force for societal transformation when ordinary people chose to act with extraordinary moral courage. The janitor who had once been invisible in corporate corridors had become a nationally recognized advocate whose influence would protect countless emergency responders for generations to come. The CEO who had once been trapped by legal constraints had become a model for how business leaders could choose ethical courage over financial expediency. And 2 families, brought together by tragedy and bound by shared values, had discovered that the most profound healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from transforming it into a foundation for building a more just future. In hotel rooms across Denver that night, 1,000 emergency responders went to sleep, knowing that their courage would be supported rather than punished, their quick thinking valued rather than second-guessed, and their commitment to saving lives protected by laws and policies that recognized heroism as something to be celebrated rather than litigated. The story that had begun with a single act of courage in rising floodwater had become a legacy of protection for everyone who would ever face the choice between following protocol and saving a life. And in that transformation, Robert Smith had found something more valuable than the career he had lost: the knowledge that his sacrifice had meaning that would endure long after his own story was forgotten. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.